Hi, folks. Why don't we, it's a little bit after 3, so why don't we start the proceedings? Hi, Kevin. I'm Harlan. That's fine. I'll tell you what's to look forward to if no one else has told you. And if people in the lobby over there can make their way in after you get your drinks, that'd be great. The weather's been beautiful. I come here via Lake of the Isles. I drive around Lake of the Isles, and there's literally hundreds of people out there walking, and their dogs and things like that. It's just amazing. And the weatherman says tomorrow's going to be in the 50s, and on Monday it's going to get in the 60s. And Monday, I think, is the first official day of spring, if I'm not mistaken. That's tomorrow. By the way, I'm Harlan Garbell. I'm the president of the organization. And today we're having our wonderful guests from the Minnesota Humanities Center. And so we also want to thank, we also have not only the people here who are attending today, but also people online who are watching through our YouTube channel. And welcome you folks as well. Hope you enjoy it. And we'd like to see you out here, but if you can't make it, that's great too, if you could see us on YouTube. And I'd like to thank John, Bob, and Mitch, who help us with the technical work to bring everybody this program that we're having today. And again, as I usually do, I just, for people who are not members, visitors, welcome. And if you happen to just stumble in thinking that this was a Rotary Club meeting, that's fine too. Stay and enjoy yourselves. Actually, that's actually happened to us at my coffee and current events. I've told this story before. Someone came to our coffee and current events at Dunn Brothers Coffee in Loring Park, and he started talking about current events, and he was just like really into it. And then he comes up to him and he says, "I thought this was an AA meeting." So, if you happen to be, saw the sign outside and and you wanted to see what we're about, welcome. And we're about critical thinking, lifelong learning, separation of religion and state, things like that, all of those good things that if you're not a member but are thinking about becoming a member, it's only $40 a year, folks, so jump on in. And we have all these great programs like today. And look at all the programs we have on Meetup. I mean, you won't see a greater group of programs for any Meetup group than you will for HumanistsMN. So that's, it's just a terrific group, and join us. And another thing I wanted to talk about before I turn it over to some other people is that we're having, this is the time of year where I need to, or the board needs to select a nominating committee for openings on the board, and we have 4 openings this year. And if you are interested in becoming more involved with HumanistsMN, by all means, talk to Jerry and Mitch, who are co-chairs of the nominating committee, and see if you have any interest in helping out. We're all volunteers here, and it's 2 hours a month to be on the board. We'd like for you to do more, of course. But if you want to find out more about HumanistsMN and get more involved, join. Not only think about joining our board, but all the other committees we have. We have the program committee. We have Humanists in Action team. They do good things, community service projects. We have the membership team. We have all kinds of committees and teams that you could join and be a part of. But one of the events that we're going to be having soon coming up in April is a membership drive. And I'd like to bring up our Vice President, Ellie Hayland, who's going to talk to you more about what that means. Ellie, coming up.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ellie Hayland, Vice President of the organization, as well as the co-chair of the marketing committee, along with the wonderful Suzanne Perry. We're really excited to announce that we are having our first ever member drive. We've been hoping to have this the last couple years, and for a number of reasons we had to put it off, but finally we'd like to announce that it's going to be April 4th through the 15th. And we're really going to try to tap into our current members to reach out to friends and family members to find people that maybe have been wanting to become a member and just didn't get around to it. That's going to be the perfect time for them to jump in. We will have free t-shirts for new members. We'll also have some incentivizing giveaways for current members who refer new members. So that's going to be really important for us to kind of get the word out. In tandem with the member drive, we also are going to have some billboards up around the city, and we're going to have some radio ads. And so we're very excited to be kind of putting forth all of these new strategies to reach out to the community, bring visibility to the organization, but also bring in new members. Little more info to come on the billboards, but we're hoping people will go find them and take pictures in front of them, put those on social media, and just try to kind of make this as broad of an outreach as we can. One other thing, when we are promoting the member drive, we're hoping to have some brief testimonials from current members about, whether it's why they joined the organization or what they appreciate that they get out of it as kind of encouragement for other people to participate. So if you are interested in providing a testimonial, if you could approach Suzanne right there, if you want to raise your hand, after the speaker and give her your contact info, she'll pass that along to me, and I'll reach out and we can coordinate on that. So very exciting to announce this today. Am I introducing someone else? He'll do it. Okay, thanks guys.
As I was driving around Lake of the Isles, something occurred to me about membership drive. I was reading something about Billy Graham yesterday. People who know who Billy Graham was, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, very popular evangelical Christian leader. And he would have tent revivals. And he would have, literally thousands of people come to a tent revival. And I was thinking about maybe propose that for part of our membership drive. So have like a humanist tent revival. And at the end of the tent revival sermon, or whatever they call that, he would ask people, whoever wants to give their lives to Jesus Christ, please come up. And of course he would have ringers. Like the first few people would be his associates. They'd come in. Then everybody else says, well, this is pretty cool. I'll come up too. So maybe we'll use that as a trick. We'll have a humanist tent revival. Those who want to give their lives to humanism can come up and join the organization. But that's just a thought I had. Whether we do that or not, I'm not so sure. As far as next month's program, I'd like to call up our board member, Jerry Smith, to tell you about a very exciting program we're going to have next month here at FUS, I believe, correct?
So, unlike today's event, our April community gathering will not be held on the third Saturday of the month. Instead, we'll be meeting on Friday, April 29th, beginning at 5:30 in the afternoon. And the reason is, we wanted to take advantage of an opportunity to hear from Andy Norman, a prominent public philosopher who heads the Humanism Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Andy will be in the Twin Cities to speak to the Minnesota Psychological Association, but he agreed to extend his visit to talk with us about his new book, Mental Immunity. He also agreed to sign copies of his book, so we'll have them available for sale at the meeting next month. And finally, some of you might know of the online Think Book Club that I host. Mental Immunity is going to be our next book, and we'll be discussing it on the Tuesday evening before Andy's Friday presentation. I'll be posting the book club event on Meetup in a couple of days. The Meetup announcement for Andy's presentation for the next month's community gathering has already been posted, so you might want to put one or both of these events on your calendar. I think they're going to be good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks, Ellie, for talking about our membership drive. I'm going to call up one of our members, Molly Wilbur-Cohn, who's going to introduce our speaker for today.
Well, hi, I'm excited to give a brief introduction to our very distinguished guest, Kevin Lindsey, Chief Executive Officer of the Minnesota Humanities Center. The humanities have an important role to play in facilitating a more inclusive world for all, especially in the way they provide an opportunity to amplify stories of people who are not in the public mainstream. Kevin Lindsey will give a presentation on the center's work to realize its vision of a more just society that is curious, connected, and passionate. Kevin Lindsey, besides being the Chief Executive Officer of the Minnesota Humanities Center, is the founder of Lindsey Law and Consulting. He has also sought to find solutions, amplify voice, and expand economic opportunities for marginalized communities during his 30-year career. Prior to coming to the Humanities Center, Kevin was Commissioner of Human Rights of the state of Minnesota for 8 years under the Dayton administration. As a member of the governor's cabinet, Kevin Lindsey worked on a variety of initiatives to expand business development and economic opportunities and civil engagement for racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities. Kevin is also a current commissioner of the St. Paul Public Housing Authority, where he has worked for the past 25 years to increase affordable housing supply and create opportunities for first-time homeowners. Great. Take it away, Kevin.
Molly, again, thank you so much for that very warm introduction. Again, my name is Kevin Lindsey, and I have the pleasure of serving as the CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center. And what I'd like to do is spend a little time talking a little bit about the work that I have been involved in at the center for the last 2.5 years. Then I'd like to talk about some of the projects and work that was undertaken during the Dayton administration that I had a part of as a commissioner. You see behind me the outside of 987 Ivy Avenue. This is actually probably 3 or 4 years ago, this photo. Some of those shrubs and greenery out front, they have been replaced because we were fortunate enough to get new bonding dollars to do some renovations to the Minnesota Humanities Center. How many of you have actually been over to the Minnesota Humanities Center? Okay. How many of you know that there are hotel rooms in the basement? Yeah, now we tell you. So there's actually 15 hotel quality rooms in the basement of the Minnesota Humanities Center. Not that many people, and I'll have to confess myself, when I went over there as a commissioner and we were having a conversation about Indian education, I was unaware of that. And then I took a tour of the building that day, and that's when I actually found out about it. So if you are interested in doing a retreat, but this is a lovely site, or maybe you want to have that tent revival over in St. Paul, you might be able to use our facilities for that. So if we could advance the slide. How many of you are aware that there are state affiliates of the National Endowment for the Humanities? I didn't know that either. So what's also interesting about the fact of state affiliates, we also have 6 affiliates in the territories of the United States. So when the National Endowment for the Humanities was created, late 60s, and then there started funding from Congress for these state affiliates, they also funded territories. And the idea really was, this might seem surprising to you, it was to make sure that we did not fall behind technology and we wouldn't become slaves to technology. This is actually within the enabling legislation. And I can kind of imagine at that point in time for the enabling legislation that they were watching Star Trek and they were really concerned that somebody could hold something in their hand and they'd actually know exactly where they were on the planet. I mean, can you imagine that? How scary that would be? So the National Endowment for the Humanities, it's been around for a while. Most of us know this because we've seen a Ken Burns documentary, and the National Endowment does do that. They do fund documentaries to support, but they also make sure that we are aware of the vibrant culture that exists within our country. And I think at this point in time, similar to back in the 60s, when there was a lot of racial strife within our country, and we were trying to figure out what our role was politically across the world, that there was importance to be able to take time and take stock of what our democracy was about and what role we should have. And as sometimes Twain reminds us that history rhymes, I'll submit to you, I think we're in this moment in time where history is rhyming. And that it's really important for us to take stock as we approach the 250th anniversary of our country to examine some of those first democratic principles. When I started at the Minnesota Humanities, the vision of the organization was a thoughtful, literate society. A thoughtful, literate society. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that vision at all as it relates to a thoughtful, literate society. But it didn't really meld with the work that the Minnesota Humanities Center was doing. What I heard when I met with folks at the Minnesota Humanities Center is uplifting the voices of those who are marginalized, giving those individuals an opportunity to be heard at a time which mattered to them. How many of you have been to law school? I know you don't know whether you want to raise your hand or not on that, do you? So this idea of being heard at a thoughtful time, for it to be meaningful for you to be heard. If you've had the pleasure or maybe the pain of going to law school, This will resonate with you on sort of the first kind of principles of constitutional law, of due process, right? It doesn't really make sense to be heard after the decision has been made, right? That's not a meaningful time. And it's also one in which your voice needs to be heard, that you actually have an opportunity to influence. So for me, when I heard that, I started thinking about justice. That really the Minnesota Humanities Center, not justice in the sense of sort of a courtroom, but justice in a much broader sense. How do people actually get heard within a democracy? We started to continue to kind of talk about the projects and the work that people were doing at that point in time. And it seemed that it was really important for us to convene and connect people together. Now, again, I had just stopped being the Commissioner of Human Rights, and that connectedness, that seeing one another, that reminded me of some of the things which Dr. King reminded, and that of being connectedness. And they also talked about, at the Minnesota Humanities Center, about moving beyond and being active, not just simply being passive. I don't know if you've heard this from time to time from your friends of color within the Twin Cities, is sometimes the Twin Cities gets a knock for admiring a problem and not actually moving forward. So, June 2019, 2 days into the job, we're taking apart the vision statement, a thoughtful, literate society, and we're playing around. And you know we have individuals who are humanities scholars, so you know we're going to have some alliteration, right? A just society that's curious, connected, and compassionate. Curious that we come to conversations with an open heart and an open mind, that we're authentically listening to one another, that we're authentically hearing what's motivating, what's stirring the individual that you're in conversation with. Connected, such that we see our lives intertwined in a garment of mutual destiny. Notions brought up by Dr. King and others. What impacts one of us impacts all of us. Compassionate, motivated beyond empathy toward action. Not we're just going to be passive and hear this, but we're actually going to find some way that we can bring about change within our society. This is the new vision for the Minnesota Humanities Center. And we have been trying to live into this vision and broaden this vision for all within our society. Understanding our past, so we have shared understanding. Have any of you been in a conversation with someone and you're thinking, that's not exactly how I remember the past? And you understand the need to make sure that you are standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and understanding that past to hopefully create a shared vision of what you can do going forward. Now, I will submit to you that that piece right now of ensuring that we see the past and we understand the past together is some of the hard work that we're doing now. I don't know, critical race theory? A few smiles, a few grimaces in the audience too, right? Again, some of the work that the Minnesota Humanities Center is doing now is creating space for leaders within schools to have that conversation, open heart, open mind, about our past. Understanding that just simply talking about the past does not necessarily mean that you're denigrating another person. Understanding that if we can get to this point of having that shared understanding, we might be able to move forward. This is the vision and mission of our respective organization. If we could advance the slide. The strategic framework here on the side, connecting, convening, catalyst, if you can see that at the bottom, sort of the two arrows coming together for connecting. The convener, that sort of bullhorn, and the catalyst, sort of the fire, actually moving forward. I told you we love alliteration, right? So for us, we see a lot of the work at the Minnesota Humanities Center as connecting people on respective issues through literature, through history, through jurisprudence, through civics. For those of you who are sitting there, well, what is the humanities again? I have this vague recollection of sort of the humanities, and there's probably a long list of it. I like to break it down in this way. It's the storytelling that we have among ourselves to make sense of our family unit. It's the storytelling as it relates to what is going on in the society around us. And it's the storytelling of the system of government which we agree to be bound by. Sounds like it's all about storytelling. But isn't that really what it is about, being human? Again, I know that there's only one lawyer in the audience, but if we were talking about storytelling, we're actually talking about judicial opinions. And those are, in essence, stories, making sense of the rules and telling us how to abide by these future rules going forward. When we think about literature and we talk about history, they're within a context and with a frame for us to understand how we should interact with one another going forward. This piece of catalyzing folks, how do we move forward? I'll submit to you that this is probably the biggest challenge as the CEO of the humanities, is to continue to push, continue to urge people once they've been given this information, not to just sit with it, but to figure out what to do going forward. Now, I'll submit to you that being someone who has served in a governor's cabinet and someone who has litigated cases, I have some ideas on how to move some things forward. Sometimes people, though, they want to take a little pause. They're not sure that they want to be that bold. I'll submit to you that I think now is really a time for all citizens within our democracy to be bold and to move some things forward. If we go to the next slide. Democracy demands wisdom and vision from its citizens. This is the language which sits within the enabling legislation for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Remember I was talking to you about Star Trek? If you also take a look in that enabling legislation, it talks about how important it is for all of us as citizens in order to have a vibrant democracy, to have a democracy that is a leading light for the world. Now we're talking about back in the 60s. It's important for all of its citizens to be educated in the humanities. Because if all of its citizens are educated in the humanities, they can demand the type of democracy, whether it's at the city, the county, the state, or the federal level, that can continue to influence and impact the entire world. Now again, this is not to say my good friends that want to push STEM are doing bad work, because they're not. But it's also important for us to balance that out, to understand of how we can be knowledgeable about the various cultures that are in our midst, to understand the history of how we have interacted with indigenous nations, to understand how civics and jurisprudence comes together and impacts all. That's also important. If we go to the next slide. Some of the programs that we have been involved in the last, well, some of them predate me, but a lot of these are within the last 2.5 years. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of these that predate me, or kind of examples. To my left, almost all the way to the far, the word Bedote, sort of the origin of life within the Dakota language, where two waters come together. We had two outstanding scholars that partnered with us to create the Bedote field trip and Bedote experience, to take a look at Pilot Knob Road, Fort Snelling, from the perspective perspective of Dakota individuals. A lot of us have been there, a lot of us have seen these respective places. What do those places mean from the Dakota lens? We run this field trip about 12 to 15 times a year. It is one of our most popular field trips. People walk away having a greater understanding about Dakota culture. And they also appreciate the fact and get a greater understanding and learning that there are multiple people and multiple learnings from one particular parcel of land. Sometimes K-12, sometimes in college, we only hear one story about one particular land, as if there are no people either before or after that matter. But today is a great opportunity for us to expand our thinking about the complexity and the richness of the land we all call Minnesota. To my immediate left, you see the picture of the death of George Floyd. We talked about the need to convey healing, the need to expand how people were viewing it. And by that I mean, it was a horrible death. The idea of someone kneeling on someone's neck into death. That's symbolized, I think, for a lot of African Americans, not just that event, not just the death itself, but the crushing weight of not being able to be seen, not really to be heard within the democracy. So this idea for us, we created a 4-part series called How Can We Breathe? And it expanded beyond just simply the interaction of police and the African American community. But how can we breathe within the disparities that we have within education? How can we breathe within the disparities that we have in housing? How is it possible that a state such as Minnesota, where less than 30% of African Americans in Minnesota own their own home? How is it that we have a situation where the median household income from African American family of 4 is still less than $30,000 in Minnesota? How can we breathe? How can we truly facilitate and be a part of the rich, vibrant democracy? What we did with this, I thought, was unique. One of our humanities officers, Ms. Rose McGee, after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, she loaded up her car with sweet potato pies, drove down there, and she wanted to facilitate conversation and discussion among people. So we built this concept of how breaking bread or sharing a piece of pie potentially could open up conversations and dialogue between people. So again, this was happening during COVID. We partnered with 4 cities, St. Cloud, Rochester, Mankato, and Duluth. And we identified people who could hand out pies to individuals in those cities that were doing good work bringing people together. I know sometimes we often think that everybody knows what everybody is doing in the city, but sometimes you find out if you stop and you ask and you create some intentional space, you find out how to even leverage more. So by handing out these pies, we were able to tap into the network of 50 individuals within those respective cities and talk about the work in which they were doing. And it was amazing to see people in Duluth who thought that they knew and they thought they were pretty plugged in, being able to find out a new thing, a new activity, someone else to partner with. And they also started to find out that the issue in Mankato, that there was somebody who was doing something similar in Rochester that they wanted to partner with. Convening, connecting, catalyzing. With malice toward none. This was an opportunity for us to bring individuals together within the same room. Sometimes we would identify classically as in the red camp, and some people classically in the blue camp. And we did that with intentionality. It's important for us not to segregate ourselves, sometimes in which we have done in our history. Most segregated time in America is Sunday at noon, Dr. King might have said once or twice. Sometimes it might be 8 o'clock on Monday morning, either Fox News or CNBC. How do we break down those silos and bring people together? So sometimes we have intentional programming, such as with Malice Toward None. We pick a particular topic and we put people together who might have different views on how an issue should come out. Feeding our souls the essence of Black joy. This program was really important because it's important for us to remind ourselves that while we might accept finite disappointment, we cannot accept or get complacent with the idea of losing infinite hope. We must remain hopeful. We must find joy. And within the African American community, sometimes those outside, sometimes within, it is always on the negative. And sometimes we have to bring great intentionality to focus on positive and joy within the community. So I love the fact that we were able to find time to meet with chefs that were making fantastic food, kind of reminded us of some of that great soul food. We took time to have a conversation and hear Thomasina Petrus sing. We took time to enjoy the artistry of artists such as Tacumba Aiken. This balancing, right? While we sometimes are taking on these tough issues, we're also in touch with what makes us human, with also what our joy inside. So we go to the next slide. You also see that we produce a pretty wide-ranging number of books. The one American Indian Youth Literature Award, those two books there, Ella Cora Deloria, Dakota Language Protector, and then our own Peggy Flanagan, Lieutenant Governor. These two books have been identified and recognized for National Book Awards. So we tried to bring some intentionality in publishing books that might not necessarily always get picked up by larger book publishing houses, and bring some intentionality for BIPOC communities. Some of you may be aware that Justice Page and then Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari are seeking to propose a Page Amendment to our state constitution. I've had an opportunity to kind of go around the state with them and talk from our vantage point about some things that we could be doing differently within education. It's quite a joy, and I'm sure that there are some of you here within the audience that have an opportunity to get into classrooms and to read within students. I'm always the kindergartner's best friend right at the end of the program. But they do enjoy hearing the stories, and especially when they can see a story about a current leader or somebody they see on TV. And I always try to read from the passage in the book for Lieutenant Governor when she was in 2nd grade. We also have other books such as Blues Vision, which was an anthology. Alex Pate, who is one of the individuals, a Minnesota Book Award winner, one of the individuals, writers within Amistad collection, to a sort of individuals who make money as a living as a writer. And then we have books such as Crossroads, where we have folks who aspire to make money as writers. So this was a collection of Somali youth, and we collected their stories, their poetry, and we put that together within a book. And that is something that we're trying to connect with various schools throughout the state. Show on the Northern Lights Dragon. This is going to be one that's going to be put to music, and then we're hoping to, again, we can figure out with the tent revival, maybe put that to the side, that you would be able to hear that book. If we go to the next slide. Programming within schools. Story circles, the idea of bringing people together to hear parents and guardians, students, faculty members, teachers, all the adults within a building, about how we can have better outcomes for students. We have been doing work within schools for about 2 decades. About 20 years ago, there was a large grant that we received from some business called Cargill. Anybody hear about it? Okay. On the basis of that respective work, there were some folks within Omaha who liked what we were doing within the schools there. And then we have been doing work in Omaha with 20 different schools for the past decade. The next 2-3 years, we're going to be doubling down on our efforts in Minnesota and kind of pulling back from within Omaha. And we're really excited about the work that we're starting to do with Roseville and then other school districts within Minnesota. The Realizing Wakanda was an event that we had with teachers, with administrators, with community members to realize this vision of what school could like for African American students. We can go to the next. Here are a couple of quotes from folks that have attended programs that we've had. The Los Días de Muertes was something that we did here on Lake Street, the Day of the Dead event, and how from the Latino or Latinx community, how they pay homage to those who have passed. So it has a different context than what we think of like with Halloween. It is really more of a celebration, a recognition, a commemoration of those who have passed on within Los Días de Muertes. And then Mountains to Lakes, this was something that we focused within the Hmong community, an opportunity for folks to be able to write from their own voice and to also experience Hmong leaders, and specifically Hmong female leaders, and the role in which they're playing in shaping direction in Minnesota going forward. If you go to the next slide. We can go to one more slide. Grant making. Again, going back 50 years ago, when the National Endowment for the Humanities started funding state humanities organizations, they gave us money to then turn around and then re-grant. In the state of Minnesota, we have what we refer to as a legacy amendment. It's Cultural Arts Legacy Amendment. So we receive money not only from the federal government, from the state government, to be able to turn around and give grants out to organizations. Most of the organizations which we give grants out to are for cultural purposes. You can see in this last 4-year period, the place that we're going to try and focus more on is Southwest Minnesota, but it is pretty even distribution throughout the state. If we can go to the next slide. Children's museums typically get a sizable portion of dollars from us, and this again comes through the state. Civic programs, the legislature historically has kind of identified or cherry-picked which civic programs, so it's not as much as a competitive grant. Continue to work on that. Cultural identity, though, and cultural grants for organizations, that is a competitive program. So that is one in which we try to bring a great deal of intentionality to organizations throughout the state to be able to compete for those dollars. $2.5 million for each year of the current biennium. So again, $50 billion budget, but we do have $5 million here for cultural organizations. If we go to the next slide. What you see here is that the number of applications that we receive only meet about half of what the request is for what we consider quality applicants. And we think at this point in time, we are trying to create greater understanding to demonstrate the vibrancy of various cultural communities. Being able to provide grants to those organizations, to communities, is critically important. And this is one which we kind of would view the state legislature could provide more funding to such organizations. If we go to the next slide. One of the things that we're also finding in the grant applications that we provide, as opposed to, say, some of the larger foundations in town, such as McKnight, the St. Paul Foundation, Minneapolis Foundation, and this is a function of their size, is that they typically don't make grants between $5,000 and $50,000. Again, it's because they're larger foundations. But for the Minnesota Humanities Center, this is space in which we can occupy, and it's great space in which to provide grants and technical assistance to grow those cultural organizations. And what we're finding is that a lot can be accomplished within those organizations if they're given an opportunity to establish some early grants and to be able to grow from that vantage point. We also try to find and simplify the application process for grant making. A lot of cultural organizations, they go to the larger foundations and they struggle with the complexity of all that's being asked from the larger grant makers. We accepted, not that we do it all the time, but we did accept one just on sort of a third grade sort of poster board. Kind of hard to imagine that the larger foundation would have accepted a poster board as an application, right? If we can go to the next slide. And for those of you who are interested or know of an organization that might be interested in applying, it'll be available on our webpage on April 18th. The deadline will be May 30th, and then we're hoping to make all the awards here by the end of June. So again, a very quick, or early July, I should say, a very quick sort of turnaround timeline for that. If we go to the next slide. So that's probably more than I said at the Cultural Heritage Grant Legacy Committee at the state legislature about the work in which we do. But I did want to share that background with you within the Humanities Center. Some folks asked me why the Humanities Center after I had served as a Commissioner of Human Rights. How many of you knew that the Department of Human Rights was in the governor's cabinet? That's about what I generally got in the 8 years. It's very unique, actually, in Minnesota, that the Department of Human Rights would be in the governor's cabinet. I learned a lot of things once I really got my hands deep into the respective statute. As someone who has always practiced employment law, I knew and I had a lot of familiarity with the work that the Department of Human Rights did on the processing of employment disputes. I also knew that they did housing disputes. What I did not know, however, is that they also had an opportunity to set workforce goals for the state on construction projects. What I also did not know is that the statute also provides for the Commissioner of Education, or Commissioner of Human Rights, to engage in education and conciliatory efforts. It wasn't really defined all that well what this meant as relates to education conciliatory efforts. In meeting with Governor Dayton, I said one of the things which I think is powerful, which is oftentimes missed, is talking about our history and educating people about how these problems came to be. Again, if you jump back in the hot tub time machine with me for a second, back to 2011, I always try to see how many people get the hot tub time reference. Few, okay. There was a report by Dr. Algernon Austin from the Economic Policy Institute. And at that point in time, he had examined the greatest unemployment disparities between whites and African Americans in the 25 largest metropolitan regions and cities. Minnesota was #1 on the list. It means we had the greatest disparity. And then looking at those same regions as relates to indigenous individuals, Minnesota also was #1 on that respective list. So again, we can talk about sort of doing some investigations, we can be doing some, decisions and opinions as it relates to claims of discrimination, But how do we systematically, how do we break down, how do we recreate a broader society where more people are included, more people are seen within that, and a holistic way in which we can bring about some measure of economic justice? Oftentimes, it is binary. It is, let's punish the wrongdoer, as opposed to going back and taking a look at the data and redesigning something, reorienting the way in which we look at something. Now, you don't believe me, do you? In Minnesota, every school district, when they suspend a child for more than 1 day, they have to inform the Commissioner of Education as to why they suspended the child. Okay? If the school district sends a kid home, suspends him for a day, they have to inform the Commissioner of Education the reason, rationale for it. And there's a list of 28 reasons for why they could do that. Fighting, drug use are on that respective list. Being absent from class is also on that list. Other is on that list. Being disruptive is on that list. Now, they're ranked from the worst, which is actually murder, and thankfully we don't have students getting really suspended for that, but that's number 1 on the list. And number 28 is other. Schools are taught and instructed by the Commissioner of Education that if you've got 2 reasons or rationale, always pick the worst. Okay? Because it's from a reporting standpoint. So here's what I'm going to tell you. When the Department of Human Rights looked at data for 5 years concerning suspensions, the vast majority of students in Minnesota were not suspended for drugs, were not suspended for fighting, were not suspended for engaging in illegal activity. They were being suspended in the 5% in the other category, 5% in the attendance category. Most of them were suspended for disruptive behavior. Now again, I'm not saying no child should ever be suspended for disruptive behavior. But more than half were in those categories. And then when you couple that with the idea that we're suspending African American students at 8 times what we're suspending a child that identifies as white, not of Hispanic origin. And by the way, the national average is shocking at 8, but here in Minnesota we're doing it at 8. It's shocking at a national level that the Native American students are being suspended at a national level at 5 times, a child that identifies as white, not of Hispanic origin, but in Minnesota it's 10 times. So again, do we really take in data? Do we really look at it? Do we really see different opportunities? Or is it just simply who are the good guys and the bad guys? That's a lot of hard work to look at systems, to look at process, to do things differently. Democracy demands the wisdom of its citizens. If we sit back and we're complacent and we look for an easy solution, doesn't necessarily mean it'll be a good solution. So I look at the Minnesota Humanities Center and some of the work that we do in bringing scholars together as an opportunity for us to ask tough questions, is to continue to probe and continue to push and hopefully give us background and information as citizens such that we can demand the democracy that we really want, that we really need, one that is truly inclusive. Now, this organization is committed to tough critical thinking. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the hard work that such an organization is going to undertake. It's not to be overtly political. I am always amazed by folks on TV when they talk about election officials and the idea that do we believe the election officials or not? In fairness within this conversation, when I was at the Ramsey County Attorney's Office, I argued election law cases. why is it that as a society we don't say, why is it that we don't believe in the rule of law? Let me make this clear. Individuals who believe that the election was stolen had opportunities to argue, and they did, unsuccessfully, before multiple judges. Why isn't this argument framed as, why don't these individuals believe the judges? Why is it that they believe that this is something that they can be beyond the law? We're in a very interesting moment in time within our country's history. On one hand, we're not that old of a country. We're not even 250. It's old for me, but it's not for a country, right? We have an opportunity to really look at and really examine what this means for having a democracy. And I submit to you, your organization, Minnesota Humanities Center, will be going much deeper in looking at this. We're hoping to have a 3-year examination and look at the legislative branch, judicial branch, and executive branch. Probably be kicking this off in about 6 to 9 months from now. And we think it'll be really important for all of us to really embrace not just being a passive citizen within our democracy, but an active citizen within our democracy. And I look forward to potential opportunities to partner with you on that. I also look for opportunities to enjoy and celebrate with you. So for us, 50 years as the Minnesota Humanities Center, on May 12th, we're going to be having an event. Invite all of you there. You'll have an opportunity to see a lot of the programs, events that we do. You'll also get a chance to enjoy the singing of T. Michael Rambo and Thomasina Petrus and others as well. So I will thank you for this opportunity. Appreciate this space and appreciate the fact that on such a beautiful, wonderful day in winter, where it's almost 60 degrees, that you actually spend some time inside with me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for that wonderful presentation. For those who have not attended our community gatherings before, at this point we have our question and answer period. I don't even know where to look at. Straight ahead. There's like multiple cameras here. And like I'm always afraid I'm looking at the wrong one. Anyway, so that usually lasts about half an hour. And then we invite you for our social hour, where we have refreshments, and we can socialize with each other. And hopefully, Kevin, you can stick around and continue talking with our membership here and attendees about about your program today, what you talked about. And we're going to have a question and answer period now. I'm going to lead off with the first question. But before I do that, I want to give a shout out to Audrey. Audrey Kingstrom, I think most people know. She's really the bedrock of our programs every month, because when I get here 2 o'clock or whatever on the Saturday, everything is set out, everything's prepared, the sign is up and everything like that. It's all due to Audrey. She really does a ton of work to make these community gatherings possible. So I just would like to show my appreciation for her. I have a question, and then by the way, those who have a question, you can just sort of sit over here and sort of queue up if there's more than one person. Well, you've been very clear what your mission is currently. 50 years ago, what was the mission of the Minnesota Humanities Center?
I don't know if I can specifically provide the definitive answer as to what they were thinking 50 years ago, but I would say, in looking at the enabling legislation, what I think Congress was hoping that the states would do is create active space to explore to explore how we could start to bridge conversations with communities. There was funding and there was support for we were fortunate to have 3 sons. What my 3 sons would say their sort of experience in high school is sort of memorizing the dates, identifying sort of, when certain things were signed, but not really sort of the backstory. I think that's probably a more fair characterization of what Congress was kind of hoping for within that space, the majority of folks within Congress. Now, knowing how legislation gets passed and knowing that sometimes there's a door that's open and that there is some hope that someone will kind of push open that door, I will say I'm sure that there were members in Congress. I'm sure that Senator Humphrey, who was one of the proponents, and Vice President Humphrey at the time, one of the proponents, wanted people to continue to push open that respective door wider and wider. And I would say how the humanities councils across the country are now talking about indigenous education, how they are talking about broadening the experience of scholars within high schools and within colleges is what they were hoping for. I had an opportunity to sit on the Social Studies Task Force. And sitting on the Social Studies Task Force, for those of you unfamiliar with that process, is that every 10 years, the Department of Education convenes individuals from broad aspects of community to examine the social studies standards. When we talk about history and we talk about broadening this, there has been some that have been overly concerned that we're walking away from the dates and the memorization. And where I'm going with this is I think that hope as it relates to bringing in the different perspectives and history of the variety of different people and communities that have made up the democracy, I think they would have hoped that that would have come sooner, and I think we're just starting that conversation.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate it as someone who has great appreciation for the humanities and the work that you're doing. So thank you so much. And everything, as a former social studies teacher as well. So I'm really with you there. Could you just say a little bit more about how you, sort of the origination of some of the programming that you do there? It sounds like you give out grants as well. But do you have a staff of people who actually put on the programming, or you put together the programs? And then I'm sure you do them for schools and whatnot. Typically, are they open to the public? Like, just sort of, what is the structure? How does programming happen at the Humanities Center?
No, that's a great question. The vast majority of the programs at the Minnesota Humanities Center are free and open to the public. So the vast majority are in that bucket. When we partner with school districts, we tend to partner a college-level scholar with instructional coaches within a school district. So most school districts will have some teachers or some individuals that help guide curriculum development within the school district. We tend to partner, most school districts refer to them as instructional coaches. And we hope to create curriculum and materials for those school districts within then to use. We sometimes have, again, this goes back to those hotel quality rooms that we have, is that we also have educator institutes in which we have educators from across the state come in and stay for a 2 or 3 day period, and then we have convenings and put together respective materials or curriculum for them to use. For events such as With Malice Toward None or How Can We Breathe, we tend to partner with various community groups to get the word out. We also broadcast or market to the public at large for folks to be able to come to our events and participate within that. Some of the work that we do, we'll partner, for example, on the commemoration of the Duluth lynching. We partnered with the federal courthouse the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial Committee. Those are the 3 names of the individuals who were lynched 101 years ago in Duluth. So we convened with that memorial group, and then we convened with the mayor and then folks within Duluth to raise visibility and awareness of that event. So it's a variety of different strategies which we use. Sometimes the scholars that we partner with are scholars that are at college level, sometimes they're within community, because we also understand that storyteller in the history is also owned by folks within community. And we try to get a good balance between the two. There are 9 individuals. Many have the title humanities officers, but we also have directors of strategic partnership that are kind of the producers, the writers, creators of these humanities programs. And from time to time, they even allow me to fiddle in that a little bit. The work that we did with the federal courthouse, we were recognized with a Diversity and Inclusion Bar Award from the Bar Association here in the state. And then our work with How Can We Breathe won the Schwartz Award, which doesn't quite sound as jazzy as sort of the Oscar or Emmys, but for humanities organizations, it's the top award. So we were very happy with the work that we did within that space.
You talked about how it was essential for us as a democracy for the electorate to have wisdom and to be willing to argue in good faith. And I would submit that those are either axiomatic or self-evident values of humanism. And my question for you is, do you think enough of us in the electorate have those values and are willing to argue in good faith? Are you optimistic that enough of us have that to make progress in solving the problems that we need to solve? And if so, why are you optimistic?
I'll come back to the quote as it relates to infinite hope. I want to be, and I hear what you're saying within that, is that do I see points in time in our current conversation where we fall short of that? Yes, I do see points in time when we fall short of it. I am amazed that members of Congress don't understand that they live in a world in which folks can replay something that happened 2 years ago, in which they say something in public, and then it gets played back. How many of us have seen something where they say this person's saying X, Y, Z, and then they play the tape, and it was like, wait a minute, you just said just exactly the opposite of that. That, to me, is so corrosive to democracy. And it really becomes challenging. But I do think the scale still tipped toward people recognizing the importance of that and sort of moving forward within that space. One of the most challenging ones for me personally within this space. As a Commissioner of Human Rights, I had made a finding that it was discriminatory under state law for organization to deny service, in this case videography, for a same-sex couple. And after that, there was what they referred to as kind of a case challenging the language within the statute, not an action which I had taken, but the language within the statute after we had made this decision. And they said that there has to be a religious exemption and that has to be broad enough for it to sustain and be constitutional. So in the case, there had been a situation where we had asked this facility, this is a same-sex couple, they want to use your videography services, or no, they wanted to use your facility, and the facility said, we will not rent to a same-sex couple. We know that they're a same-sex couple, we're not going to rent to them. I therefore, as a commissioner, knew that this was a same-sex couple. I knew that this was a facility. I had asked the facility, and the facility had told me no. Pretty straightforward. A videographer outside of the St. Cloud area says, on the basis of this decision here, I'm fearful of entering into a contract with a same-sex couple, I want a determination by a court that if I was asked that I could say no to that couple. This case went all the way to the 8th Circuit, and there are about 4 or 5 of these cases that are on our way to the United States Supreme Court at this time. And we argued, with the Attorney General's help, that if you can deny someone the right to a commercial good or service on the basis of their sexual orientation, what stops you the next time from saying, I'm going to deny it on the basis of race, or I'm going to deny it on the basis of gender? And the decision basically says, well, we'll decide that the next time around. That's not a really good reason, right? But in essence, so I want to say, I do feel that pain, right? That there are times where it appears like it's falling short. But I want to say, on balance of the times in which I see logic winning the day, that we have to continue to push that forward. People follow me with that example? Okay. When you might hear these podcasts about like shadow docket and sort of religious freedom type cases, again, not to belabor this point, but I think it's just really important. Courts draw their power within a democracy by logic and by storytelling which is consistent. And I think when we have the Supreme Court issuing opinions without explaining it, without showing the work, we should all be concerned over that. It's one thing for me to say I disagree with the court on something, but it's very different to say I don't know what the court decides, or the basis upon which the court is deciding things. And that's kind of where we're creeping into that territory.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm processing still on a lot of it. Some of us in this organization, know the Humanities Center as an event center, as a place to go and have a wonderful gathering. I had no idea of all what you do, and so I love what you're working on. In fact, some of the words in your vision are exactly the words that we have in some of our promotions: compassion and curious. I think those are the 2 that struck me, so there's a deep connection. Also, as somebody on the Humanists in Action Committee, in addition to community service, the immediate problem, we work on legislative and policy action, and much of it, in my mind, is about justice. And so I just really feel strongly and we're wishing for the same things, for sure. Thank you. So I'm trying to process and pare down. I was taking lots of notes. On one question, kind of a little bit similar to what David asked, you mentioned about a program with Malice Toward None and bringing together people who appear to be ideologically different. And I wondered, how did that go? How did you maybe find a bridge for them? One thing I have thought, away from issues, is when you get to know individuals as a human, we're mostly quite similar in our goals. We may have different means to those ends, but mostly we need and want the same things. But on issue, I'm curious. I'd love to hear. Thank you.
Well, first off, thank you for those kind words, and I appreciate bringing that connection between the 2 organizations together. You are correct that one of the ways in which there can be positive movement, sometimes within the political system, although it always feels like there's gridlock, is when there's opportunities to show connections between individuals on some respective issues. Now again, I won't say that it isn't hard sometimes, because it is sometimes very hard. But it does require that end game and that longer vision and delayed gratification, I guess, right? And that can become challenging within our society. But when we're talking about the overall stakes, right, it is important to kind of remind ourselves that it's worth it to stay within that conversation. Legislator who will remain nameless here, I remember this legislator talking about veterans in a way that the legislator made it sound as if the constituents that I were representing would not have individuals who were veterans, which, you know, was highly offensive, because I'm sure that the legislator was doing so because of the hue of my skin. And I'm sitting here in the back of my head processing, you know, a cousin that was one of the Tuskegee Airmen, a cousin who had died on the USS Cole, but I could not bring that out because we would have taken even more steps backwards, right? So I want to acknowledge that difficult and that tension within it. I think the thing for us as where we are now and sort of moving this forward is to grab a hold and really reframe a lot of these issues and appreciate the fact that there will be pushback as we reframe, but it's really important for us to hold our ground on why that reframing is important. We're in a conversation now about critical race theory, and for us, this is really talking about our history and why it's important for us to understand kind of these democratic principles. Now, folks will talk about why it makes someone feel bad, and I will say, I want to make sure no kid really feels bad, but that's going to require us to have a conversation about the past so we can all heal, we can all move forward together. That book, as it relates to Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, that passage of like when she's in second grade, she talks about sitting in a classroom and the teacher talking about Native American children as if they don't exist anymore. So if someone was talking about, well, I don't want my child to feel bad, I was saying, well, let's just make sure that we all agree on that, because there are some children now that sometimes feel bad within the classroom. And I don't want the lesson to be taken away from when we talk about our history, that you as that child sitting in the classroom are bad, because that's not the intent. The democracy started not with all white men being able to vote, only white men who had property. This great experiment is how to be more inclusive to more and more people. How can that be bad? I think we got to claim that and reframe it. Just an example.
Okay, let's see if I can get this out about right. I'm fully supportive of the efforts to address historical discrimination, whether it's based on race, ethnicity, gender, you name it. And I'm fully supportive of things that are being done to kind of, to recognize the history, the ongoing effects of this, and the efforts that you've talked about, for instance, to make people aware of their culture, their history, their past. But it seems to me that in what's happened in our country, that we've gotten very divisive about this. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, in a sense that people now in historically disadvantaged groups are defining themselves strictly in terms of those social identities. As a black person, as a Latino, as a gay person, etc. And personally, I think that's a very limited notion of individual identity. I think, and one of the things that really appealed to me about humanism was the fact that it was about us as human beings, our common humanity. And when I think of humanities, I think of people like Shakespeare and Montaigne, and people that you could talk, that anybody could read that work and really connect to it. And so I'm wondering, when you do this work, yes, I mean, you're doing important stuff in helping individuals, students, whatever, recognize and become aware of and proud of their history, but do you also recognize at the same time the importance of helping these people recognize that they've got things in common, even with an old white fart like me? That's important. And we're all really ultimately human beings. We're in this together. We've got some differences. We've got some things to fix. But how do you do that? What do you do in these programs that reinforces the common humanity that, for instance, humanism is really about?
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, we appreciate, what'd you say, old farts, right? He's speaking for himself. Okay. So, did we all feel good when we laughed? Yes. So one of the things I was asked to sort of facilitate a community conversation on bridging sort of divide. And I started saying, who in the room wants more friends? I asked people to raise their hand. Everybody raised their hand. Okay? I'm not asking or not talking about these things to divide, but rather to explore and to find ways in which we can create greater friendship, greater circle. This is probably not going to be surprising to you, but race is a social construct, right? In this society, it's a pretty heavy construct, right? So that's why it is really discussed the way that it is. But that doesn't mean that it's the limiting and it's the sole identity for myself or for others within that. This is a delicate balancing act. I think it's one that we have delayed having for quite some time. When we move from a society in which, when I moved here in '91, that I could tell the joke, there's only 3 black guys here in town, Kirby Puckett, Prince, and me, right? There seem to be a lot more residents to that, right? But the reality is, 6 years ago or 7 years ago, more high school students graduated, and under the social construct, they would be viewed as people of color. That is a vastly different America that we're moving toward. So how do we understand that it is not about the social construct, but it is a recognition of the familia? It is a recognition of customs and traditions, of whether from my parents' side, my dad's side from Arkansas, my mom's side from Mississippi, and bringing the full flavor of that into the conversation. That, to me, is where I'm hoping and driving for others to get to. It is not to segregate and isolate and silo and divide up. And I'll submit to you, I love Westerns, right? As a kid, my nickname was Cowboy Dan. But the problem with that is good and evil. This group gets this group just gets that. How do we create an inclusive society where all get nurtured, all get supported? Now, I know for this group, right, and then saying it in a church and the humanism thing, it's just right there. I just can't get away from it. So I grew up, and my parents took me to Second Avenue Baptist Church, okay? The pastor there said, there's not really much difference between heaven and hell. Both have these long banquet tables. There's more food than anybody can consume. But there's one thing, and there's also this thing too about these utensils. The utensils are like oversized. But the difference between hell and heaven is, in hell, they're using these oversized utensils and they keep trying to feed themselves and they can never quite get it there. Whereas heaven, they have figured out how to reach across the table and feed one another. I submit to you at this point in time, how do we, the richest nation that has ever been on the face of the planet, figure out how to feed one another? And stop thinking about how it denigrates and it's zero-sum game. That's the challenge before us. And within a democratic framework, we should be able to solve this. If we sent somebody to the moon in the 60s, and now we're sending Shatner back into space, it was out there, right? I had to say it. So we should be able to solve this problem.
So hi, I'm Mitch. So I live in Minneapolis. I love Minneapolis. And as the epicenter of a lot of what has happened, do you have any thoughts on what Minneapolis should be doing that it isn't, or what we should be advocating for specifically here, because a lot of the problems of inequality reside right here in this city. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about how it should be moving forward, or if it is doing a good job.
So I was commissioner when Jamar Clark was killed. And I distinctly recall the next day being in the governor's residence, in which we were discussing disparities and sort of challenges facing Minnesota as a whole, and what we should move forward. I was to the governor's right when he said that had Philando Castile been white, he would not have been killed. So I've given some thought to these respective issues. I won't give the mayor a scorecard, right? But what I would say is, as a state and as a community, there are some things that we are doing well, and there's actually movement on. There are some things where we appear to be stuck because we're still in this blame game, as opposed to saying, let's just reframe, restructure how we do things. We're stuck in, I gotta assign blame before we can move forward. An example of things which have changed, which may not necessarily be as evident to as many people as say myself because of where I was in proximity to some of these issues. When Jamar Clark was killed, the Minneapolis Police Department was adamant that no police officer would be interviewed for at least 3 days. I'll sum it up this way. Governor Dayton wasn't happy about that, okay? So the idea of where we get to Floyd, where the police chief fires the police officers, that's in the span of less than 10 years. The conversation about what the investigation would do at Clark, if you take a look at how the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension is talking at the podium at that point in time, and you compare it to how it is talking about how it's going to lean forward and do the investigation after Floyd, night and day difference. Night and day difference. That's a contentious issue, but yet you can see progress being made in kind of visible ways beyond just simply the guilty verdict in Floyd. So yes, process can change. One where I would have hoped we would have made more, and I don't want to say we've not made any, is the one that I alluded to earlier about suspensions. And I do appreciate kids being out of school as it relates to COVID. But that almost seems like we have to have a bad guy and punish the bad guy to be able to move forward on that, as opposed to how we look at children and whether suspending them, taking them out of the school is a bad thing. 2011, Minneapolis Foundation published a report, 1 in 10 kindergartners who are African American have been suspended for more than a day. Again, I'm not saying that there's no 5-year-old in any situation that can never be suspended, but 1 in 10? We all gotta look at ourselves at that point, right?
This will be the last question. Any questions? Molly, you have a question? Okay.
Thank you for your words. You may or may not use the word hopeful or optimistic, but that's what I try to apply. I mean, it's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I mean, so my question is more operationally. You noted wonderful quantity of grants. That's beautiful. 2 things on that. I saw the numbers, dollars available go up. Do you think that's going to continue, or why? You know, how did that happen? And a couple examples of who's getting grants. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll keep this quick if you've got another question. So folks are getting grants to do documentaries, they're getting to do books, they're getting to do cultural celebrations, they're getting to bring forward dance, different ways to express themselves from a cultural standpoint, the cultural heritage grants. Dollars, I'm hoping, is going to go up. We'll see what happens in the November election, but if the individuals roughly remain the same on both the House and the Senate on cultural legacy, I think people like the trajectory of where things are going, so I could see some additional dollars. We have a $9 billion surplus. The legacy is a dedicated revenue fund, so there will be more money available. It just then becomes a question of political will from the legislature, but I think it's moving in the right direction.
Kevin, thanks so much for your excellent, thought-provoking presentation. It was wonderful. You just brought that up again, and I wanted to find out more about this suspension business. This is when you were the Commissioner of Human Rights, and you said, this is a systemic problem, and I was wondering how you dealt with it as with the Commissioner of Education. Was that something that was changed somewhat at the time when you were commissioner?
So when I was commissioner, it was 38 school districts where we negotiated a settlement agreement as opposed to going to court over the respective issue. And I will say, just to show kind of contention on this, that there are some lawyers that don't believe that the Commissioner of Human Rights actually has jurisdiction over such disparities. So it's an unresolved legal issue because there's no specific Supreme Court case saying that, although there are individuals who would take the opposite position, and I'm one of those, but I just put that out there. Those 38 school districts had an opportunity to enter into negotiation or settlement agreements with us. The primary driver for that is working with community. We did not top down say you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4 things. It wasn't a laundry list, but we identified best leading strategies across the countries to reduce disparities. And then we empowered the superintendents and school districts to work with parents and guardians to be able to identify a local strategy which made sense for them. We're working with a school district in Cloquet on some work. I was really appreciative that one of the very first things that they did was identify how they had driven down suspensions. And one of the things there was they had great disparities of suspensions for Native American students. So again, let's be hopeful. Things are changing, moving, but there are some other school districts that aren't reporting out in that way at all. Last thing on just the hope piece. I think you can see the US Bank Stadium project from here, or maybe if you kind of look around the corner. 2011 workforce goal, or workforce actual participation for people of color on state projects was less than 11%. On the US Stadium Bank project, it was 36% for people of color, and then for women, was the first time any project over $250 million had more than 11% women participation on such a project. In that 5 years from 2011 to 2016, 11% to 26.5% on all state construction projects. It's possible to do things differently. It does require intentionality on our part. And I'm grateful and thankful for organizations such as yourselves to push us to think differently and expand our horizons. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Actually, we have one more question because we have viewers on YouTube who are watching this.
Okay.
And we want to make sure that they have an opportunity to participate by asking a question as well. So if you would stay for one more question,
I'm
that'd be
happy
great.
to.
Okay, so I'm John. I'm the YouTube representative here. So I am asking this on behalf of Mark, and I think his question is quite similar to Jerry's. So you've already spoken on some of these themes, so not a big deal if you want to keep it brief. But he just asked, sometimes it seems that by paying attention to voices, or by paying increased attention to the voices of many different communities, we end up increasing the sense of division in our overall society, and what can we do to address that?
So what I hear within that is a balancing act, and life is about a balancing act. So one could look at the many different ways in which race and ethnicity is sort of identified, and then stopping and then asking the question as relates to each racial group or each ethnic group. Have they reached full participation, or whatever we would think their participation within society or community is? Is it being realized? I don't want to go that far, and I hope no one has taken sort of what I had said within that space. And let me go back to the construction piece. I said people of color. I did not say necessarily African Americans went from 7.5% to 14%, because that was sort of the realization of what they were in the workforce, or Asian Americans went from 5 to 9.5%. Not in that space. But let us understand the strength of the social construct and what it is within our society. And if we don't look at broad strokes as relates to how race is impacting folks' participation, or if we don't look to see as relates to gender, how women are participating in or out of systems, we don't create more equitable, inclusive outcomes. Okay? How many people go jogging? How many people have ever pushed a stroller? How many of you ever know a curb cut? A curb cut, right? You get to the end of the sidewalk, it goes down. You know how many people benefit from a curb cut? Now, there are some folks that need wheelchairs on my block, and they benefit from it. There are folks such as myself that have 2 dogs. I appreciate the curb cut. And I'm not too far from where my sons or others might go running. They also appreciate the curb cut. How do we create a society which broadly looks at sort of how the social construct is impacting certain groups and say, let's do some things differently? Let's don't go so far down the line and say, well, here's a checklist of every particular racial ethnic group, and we got to check to make sure. It's somewhere in between, right? The nice thing is, we can continue to have conversations just like we did today. Did anyone get mad? Did anyone yell? Did anyone lose their cool? We all feel like we came out with a couple good ideas that we could do differently. Just think if we continue to add all those good ideas of what we could do. I'm a big believer as it relates to the combined wisdom and multiplying it as an effect. My mom used to work at Motorola, and she was in charge of the mainframe there and keeping it cool. So like this size room, I remember as sort of a teenager being in it and thinking about how big this mainframe is. Now in my mid-50s, I sit there and think about the amazing amount of power, computer power, that I have in my fingertips. Are you saying a society that can do that can't figure out how we can all get along and get together as people? Come on, we can do better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if folks would exit to the lobby, we'll have our social hour. Thank you.